this evening for our mental health awareness and COVID event. We are live streaming as well as recording this event. So for those that are joining via Zoom, please note that this session is being recorded for others that could not join us. Again, we're so happy to have each of you with us this evening as we talk about mental health, which is such a crucial topic in today's world in the context of COVID. So we have amazing panelists here, myself, Shanequa, City Council candidate in District 12, Abigail Martin, City Council candidate in District 11, Tricia, and Ingrid. So we're going to introduce ourselves in just one moment. But before I do that, I actually am going to make sure I am changing over the names of those that are coming in under my name. So if you notice your name is under my name, which is a weird technicality of Zoom, just raise your hand for us so we can change it over to your name, and you can put it directly in a chat box for us.
Hi, Oriana. Good to see some familiar faces on here. Hi, David.
Yeah.
Hello.
Awesome. So I see one of you raise your hand. If you want to just put you chat to me your name, I can fix your name for you under Zoom. All right, so let's get started. I would like us to start off by just introducing ourselves. So starting with Abigail, Tricia, and then Ingrid, please tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, and a little bit about your candidacy. So and following that, we'll jump into our first question. So starting with Abigail, Tricia, and then Ingrid.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming this evening. I'm really excited to talk about a topic that can be a little bit heavy, but we are used to that as social workers. My name is Abigail Martin. I am running for City Council in the 11th District, which includes the neighborhoods of Wakefield, Woodlawn, Riverdale, Van Cortlandt Park Village, Kingsbridge, Bedford Park, and Norwood. I am a longtime social worker. I am also a military spouse and a public school parent and an adjunct professor at the Columbia School of Social Work. I decided to run for city council after watching COVID devastate the Bronx. I think as we rebuild New York City, we need somebody who has experience working within the many systems that impact New Yorkers at the table as we rebuild. I'm focused on building a affordable New York City that is just and equitable for all New Yorkers. And I will pass it over to Tricia.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. And I apologize if you hear a crying baby in the background. That is my son, and it is getting close to bath time. My name is Tricia Shimamura, and I'm running for City Council here in District 5, which includes the Upper East Side, Roosevelt Island, East Harlem, and parts of Midtown East. I'm a proud Japanese Puerto Rican running to be the first person of color to ever represent my district. I would also be the first Japanese American ever elected in New York State, which is crazy and exciting, and honestly never been more meaningful. I am also a mom, as you heard, to Teddy, my 21-month-old son, and I join the hundreds of thousands of other working parents out there who are struggling right now to balance work and home. And finally, I am a social worker. I got my MSW from NYU, and I started out working as a public school social worker in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn. At the end of the day, there are a lot of reasons why I am not the typical candidate who runs for office, but really only one reason why I'm here, and it's because I love my community, and I want to do everything I can to make sure the working families, seniors, small businesses, and every other resident living here to make sure that they have what they need to stay in our city and thrive. I'm really excited to be a part of this panel. I do believe that social workers belong in more spaces. I think that we are uniquely qualified to be in our legislative halls and chambers, and I'm so excited about the conversation tonight. Thanks.
Thank you, Tricia. Ingrid?
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Ingrid Gomez, and I am a New York City Council candidate running to represent District 21 in Queens, which includes the neighborhoods of Corona, East Elmhurst, Jackson Heights, and Elmhurst. I am a longtime social worker as well. I've been in the field for 17, going on 18 years. The last 7 years, I've worked in my community here in Corona, which was at the epicenter of the pandemic. During this time of the last 12 months, I saw so many families devastated by sickness. Many people died, hundreds of people died, thousands of people got sick, thousands lost their jobs. So whenever you saw our video about Elmhurst Hospital, those were my clients. Those were the people that suffered the most. Whenever you saw lines of people outside food pantries, those were the people that I serve. So I am here because I want to discuss the mental health effects of COVID-19 on our communities. We have very vulnerable populations here in my community, my district. We have immigrant families, undocumented immigrant families, and the essential workers that basically kept the city running. So there's a mental health fallout, I believe, due to COVID-19 and its effects on all of us. So I look forward to talking more with all of you about how we can help each other, support each other throughout this time. So thank you so much to Shanequa for hosting, and thanks to Tricia and Abigail as well, some of my favorite ladies.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. And just to mention, to note that we are all social work candidates for city council. So that's really exciting. It's always so special to me to share a space like this with other social workers who understand and who get it. So I'm Shanequa Moore again. I am a candidate for city council and District 12, which incorporates neighborhoods of Wakefield, Allenville, Edenwald, Eastchester, Williamsbridge, Baychester, and Co-op City. And I'm a second generation Bronx native. I like to wear that hat with pride. I say it all the time. I'm also a single mother, a licensed social worker, and I consider myself a servant. I've spent my entire life invested in the Bronx community, serving in so many different ways, from social worker to youth pastor to youth minister to caseworker to teacher, you name it. I believe that it is time for true leadership to step up to the plate. I believe that our community deserves and needs transparent leadership and leadership that's going to be invested in the needs of their children and their families. And I believe I'm that kind of leader. I'm also a nonprofit executive where I started and founded my own nonprofit, I Raise Girls and Boys, which provides critical school social work services to kids in public school education. We've been able to serve over 10,000 kids over the last 8 years, and we're continuing to push forward and be at the forefront of mental health issues. So I'm excited about this conversation tonight, excited to share this space again with all of you that have joined us and with my colleagues, Abigail, Tricia, and Ingrid. So without further ado, we'll jump into our first question. But before we do that, I actually wanted to launch a quick poll. And those that are online, I'm sorry, on Zoom, you may not be able to participate in a poll. But this is an anonymous poll, so don't feel pressured like anyone is going to see your answers. We won't see it. But there's 2 questions there, so we'd love for you to take about 1 to 2 minutes to answer, and we'll give you some time. It looks like 13% of the people voted. 20%, great. 33%, 40, awesome. All right, looks like we're halfway. And for those of you that are on Facebook, the first question on the poll is, in the past 12 months, how often do you practice self-care? And the second question for those that are on Facebook is, in the past 12 months, have you experienced any of the following: anxiety, depression, stress, loss of loved one, loss of employment, or other loss? We'll give it 3 more. There's 3 more people that need to vote. So cast your vote. We're almost there. All right. And I'm going to end the polling. So I am going to go over the results really quickly before we launch into our first question. So again, in that first question, the question was, in the past 12 months, how often do you practice self-care? So 9% said never, 82% said sometimes, and 9% answered always. So that's a huge number of people that don't always practice self-care, but that may need to work on practicing self-care and prioritizing themselves. And that second question, in the past 12 months, have you experienced any of the following? 91% answered yes to anxiety. That is a huge huge. That's a great percentage. Depression, 45% answered yes. Again, 91% answered yes to stress. 36% of us here experienced loss of loved one. 18% loss of employment, and 36% other type of loss. So that's just among us here. For those that are watching on Facebook, I'm sure the numbers are probably higher. So just in those short results that we just went over, we see that mental health has become such a crucial piece. And I'll just say this really quickly, that and according to a recent study on mental health in America, youth mental health have been seen to be worsening in the US. And COVID has really placed us at a place where mental health has been, our mental health quality, access to quality care, and also our mental health in general has been declining. So a lot of people are reporting increase in anxiety, increase in depression, increase in not having access to receive care for unmet health, mental health issues. So we see that, again, this is a huge topic here and why we're meeting tonight. So let's jump into our first question. And thank you to all of those that just participated in that poll and for your transparency. So our first question this evening is, and starting with Abigail, then Tricia, then Ingrid, and then I will answer. Tell us, in your own opinion, how has COVID changed mental health in your own community? So that's the community that you're running in, and you can repeat what community you're running in, and then tell us how it's changed in your community. So Abigail.
Starting off on mute, man. Okay, you think you would get the hang of it. As I mentioned, I'm running for City Council in District 11. So my community includes the neighborhoods of Wakefield, Woodlawn, Riverdale, Bedford Park, Norwood, Van Cortlandt Village, and Kingsbridge. We are home to Montefiore Hospital. We're also home to many nursing homes, and we are home to a lot of essential workers. I think at one point, the unemployment rate was almost 40%, according to some estimates. So COVID has been felt here in many different ways. And I think the way mental health has changed, it's just the acute need for more mental health services. There are people in our community that work at various hospitals throughout the Bronx and throughout New York City. One of them is my very good friend, and I talk to her on a regular basis. She's a respiratory therapist, so she was the doctor that was intubating and extubating COVID patients. And we talk about the trauma that she and her colleagues are now dealing with, and the symptoms. And trauma manifests itself in people very differently. For some people, it can look like aggression. For some people, it can look like sadness. Some people can't sit still. Some people have flashbacks. There's just so many different symptoms. And as we move forward and as we come out of the COVID crisis, I think we need to be prepared to fully fund mental health services and be prepared to help this city. We're going to have essential workers, doctors, children, parents. The entire experience has been traumatic in different ways for everybody. And as a city, I know that we are very strong together. New Yorkers are such a strong group of people, but we will have to prepare to address what's coming in terms of trauma-related symptoms.
Yeah, I'll just jump in there. So I have two pieces to this. One is that in my district, which is again District 5, the Upper East Side, Roosevelt Island, East Harlem, and parts of Midtown East, over a quarter of my population is over the age of 65. So when we talk about the mental health needs, when we talk about recovery from COVID, I really do always want to make sure that we're also thinking about these things and how they impact seniors. And for seniors, really it's a question of, as Abigail was mentioning, funding. It's a question of how do we the access to a vaccine has been anything but smooth. A lot of our seniors have still been locked inside without much access to other healthcare needs or other social services or social supports for over a year. When it comes, I oftentimes talk about investing in our care economy, which is actually funding our home healthcare workers and those who are supporting our seniors, which is far too often, and they are underpaid and under-resourced there. And so, certainly I would say that when we think about the mental health needs, we need to think about isolation. We need to think about lack of access to food, lack of access to appropriate housing, lack of access to appropriate social services, as particularly for our seniors. The other thing that I'm going to then part one, but then the second part to this is that, I think that particularly as a proud Japanese Puerto Rican woman who is running in this race, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the increased anxiety and fear that is being felt throughout our country right now amongst the Asian American community. Particularly in the last few weeks, as we continue to see hate crimes in our city, let alone our country. There's not one a member of the Asian American community who I have spoken to who's doing okay right now. And it is completely justified. I myself am fearful. We have loved ones who we are fear. And I think that we really are at a point where it is incumbent upon all of our elected officials and all of those who wish to be elected officials to realize that we need to stand up against hate. We also need to recognize that although the COVID pandemic may have exacerbated and unveiled a lot of bias and bigotry and white supremacy against communities of color, and particularly the Asian American community, this hate is nothing new. My grandparents were both interned in different Japanese internment camps. I carry that history with me, just that very recent history with me everywhere I go. And, there's a lot that needs to be done. I'm going to just end with one kind of terrible statistic that just always sticks out in my mind. Asian Americans make up almost 15% of our population. And yet, when you look at our budget and when you look at what type of social services are being funded, what type of mental health services, what type of housing, language access, food services are being funded, 1.4% is going to the Asian American population. Our budget is a reflection of our values, and clearly there is a breakdown here of what we value and how we value this kind of critical component of our city. So yes to funding services for our seniors, yes to funding services for our Asian American community, yes to seeing the intersection of those things and of those identities, particularly in our city.
Hi there. So I'll just jump in. Can everybody see me, by the way, when I speak? Okay. Just wondering. So as I mentioned earlier in my introductory remarks, I am in Corona. I'm a resident of Corona, and I am hoping to represent the communities of Corona, East Elmhurst, Jackson Heights, and Elmhurst. And as I mentioned before, we were at the epicenter of this pandemic. Many, many people died here. Thousands of people were ill. There was a recent study in the New York Times that cited that 51% of Corona residents had tested positive for COVID-19 antibodies. So we have in Corona approximately 120,000 residents. So if you do the math, it's 60,000 or more got sick. And so therein you see that there is going to be a mental health crisis. It's really creeping up on us. There are community members who have reached out and said, can you refer me to someone to talk to? And the problem is that many times therapy is, 1, not accessible, 2, too expensive, 3, there's a stigma around receiving mental health services. And so again, I personally am a mental health therapist, social worker, and I work with 3- and 4-year-old children and their families. And right now, in terms of like what you see, the signs you see, as Shanequa and Abigail, I think, mentioned, you see different symptoms in children, right? Children can become really moody, some can become aggressive, some can also be very hyperactive, right? They can't sit still. But some of these older children actually become much more reclusive. They become much more isolated. They don't want to talk to their parents. And there is a mental health crisis with youth. We have to really, really look at this and really begin to address it, because as children go back to school, as they've been going back in waves, we first had the elementary school students and then the middle school students, and now high school students, we are reintroducing them to their natural habitats, right? But these months that they had at home cut them off from their natural sort of social networks, right? Like they were with kids all the time, and they, children who are now preteen and teens, they rely on their peers. They want to be around their peers. And when they've been stuck at home doing remote learning, that's really affected their mental health, that's affected their development, and so all of these things put together, right, are really gonna have a fallout if they haven't already. I've spoken to other therapists who've said that the number of children referred to them has increased. It has increased incredibly, again, because this is a huge mental health crisis. And we need to have more affordable services. We need to have more access. We need to still work on destigmatizing mental health, right? Many people in my community and in other communities of color think, why should I go talk to someone? That's not something that we do. I'm not crazy. I mean, there's just a lot of different things, right, that people say that prevent them from really accessing the help they need. So we as social workers who are aspiring to be your next elected officials, we also have a lot to bring to the table. We understand, based on the work we've done with children, with families, and with communities, about the needs of our respective communities. And so central to that is really providing the kind of support children need. And I'm speaking specifically about children because that's the work I do. But every school needs to have a social worker. Every school needs to have a social worker. Let me repeat that. We also need to have social, emotionally healthy schools. And what I mean by that is having schools, right, with teachers that are trained in trauma, with teachers that are able to also understand the signs of a child who is traumatized, who is depressed, who is anxious. And instead of, if a kid is acting out in class, instead of saying, okay, you know what, I'm going to call your parent, you're just impossible to deal with. And that's like, it leads to punishment, right? Instead of saying, why are you behaving this way? You should ask, what happened to you? What happened? So again, these are really important issues. And what I would want is for every school to have social, emotionally healthy curriculum where we teach teachers, where we train them on trauma and on really building a healthy school environment. And of course, again, having the right supports, having mental health counselors and social workers. So those are some of my ideas. I think we can do so much, again, given our background as social workers. And I really hope that we are able to meet this moment with the right resources, with the right mental attitude, right? That we need to come in here and really address the issues at the core, not just superficially, not just like, okay, we've dealt with all this trauma for the last year, but we really have to address it. We can't just say, okay, we're done. Now we're back to normal. No, stop, slow down. Let's really process what's happened. Let's grieve, let's heal. And that can only be done, like, I think, in community and with people like us, Shanequa, Abigail, and Tricia, who are social workers who know how to help heal, right? So anyway, I'll leave it there. I've said enough.
That was excellent, Ingrid. Thank you so much for that, Tricia and Abigail. And I guess I'll go now. So again, I will be representing hopefully the neighborhoods of Wakefield, Olinville, Edenwald, Eastchester, Williamsbridge, Baychester, and Co-op City. I guess I can start from my position as a nonprofit leader and what I've seen directly with the children that I serve in my community. At the very beginning of the pandemic, obviously, it was very uncertain, chaotic, and very scary for all of us. One of the main things that I seen was this theme of fear. A lot of our kids were afraid to die. They were afraid. They were just afraid of getting COVID, afraid of their loved ones dying. We, in my organization, we were able to really pull through and provide essential services to young people, mentoring, counseling services to kids, and also to parents. So we also noticed this pattern of parents. We've always known that parenting has been stressful, but there was another layer now to the stress that parents were dealing with and are still dealing with, from uncertainty in terms of their job security, financial security. Before there were stimulus checks or anything rolling out, people were really uncertain about how they were going to eat or feed their children. Education, remote learning changed so much for our parents who, like myself, who had to learn to be teacher and learn to be mom and also be a nonprofit leader and also a candidate for city council. So juggling that, but really that new role of being a teacher and dealing not with your own anxiety, but also with the anxiety of your child and living in a very uncertain world. And us in the Bronx, we were also at the epicenter of everything, right? We were one of the counties, one of the largest that had the highest cases of COVID, of people that died. We've seen so many of our seniors pass away, so many of our loved ones and friends and community members. And it was a very uncertain time. There, for me, one of the things that I was able to do was launch a study, which is still in the process of being analyzed. But the study started last year as a result of COVID. It is called The Psychological Impact of COVID on Children in New York City. And we focused on kids ages 12 to 19. And the reason why we really launched that study was because we were seeing these themes of kids dealing with anxiety, depression, isolation, nightmares, exhibiting all of these symptoms of trauma. And then on the other hand, we've seen the same thing with parents. Parents were in desperate need of help, in desperate need of hope. And I don't think that just went away. We're still in this pandemic. We are obviously at a better place, right? But as you've seen, when we first launched the poll earlier today, a lot of us have dealt with loss of some kind of loss or some kind of trauma or anxiety. And that is something that we're still living with. So what does that mean for us? That means that we have to step up, our government, our elected officials, and we have to prioritize mental health in New York City. Some of the things that I would like to do in council is to make sure and I think you talked about this, Tricia, is to push not just for a social worker in every school, but to decrease the ratio of social work to students. Right now, the average is about one social worker to every 500 students. That's insane. Our kids are not being seen. Their mental health is not properly being cared for. So I would love to push for legislation to really reduce that number. There should be one social worker to every 200 students, so that we can ensure proper care for our kids. Tricia talked about a really crucial piece, that social isolation. Our kids were not allowed to go outside, right? We were in national shutdown, which means we could go nowhere. And so what did that mean for our kids? Our kids, they didn't really grasp or understand what that meant. One moment they were in school, the next moment they were in shutdown mode, and we were in that mode for so long. And so our kids, they missed a really crucial part of their lives with social development. And so there are implications that we have to be thinking about, not just as social workers, but as a community, as parents, how our kids have been impacted. And what are the future implications that we're not necessarily seeing right now. Another piece I want to bring in really quickly is racism and mental health. And this was something that I was very vocal with and still am last year. It was a very interesting time that we lived in, because not only were we dealing with this harsh pandemic, but there was also the racial injustice movement that really sparked after the death of George Floyd. And so we see not just the pandemic and people sort of dealing with trauma around that, but it was also the unaddressed trauma of racism, specifically on the impact of racism on people of color. And thank you so much, Tricia, for bringing it up. She talked about being an Asian and person of color, and the things that she's dealt with throughout her life and her ancestors. And me as a woman of color, as a Black woman, the compounded, sustained intergenerational trauma of racism and that impact on my mental health, my family's mental health, and my community mental health. One of the things I appreciate is that in COVID, and from the spark of that George Floyd movement, we finally addressed something that was like the elephant in our nation, and that was systemic racism. And we're not there yet. We're nowhere near in terms of undoing it, but we are certainly at a better place, because we've had national conversations at the table to talk about how racism has been impacting us as a nation, our morale, our integrity, through our policies, and also through mental health. So I am really, one of the things that I've been working on is building racial centered practices to address in racism and people of color. And that looks like circles of healing. That looks like incorporating spirituality when we're having mental health conversations. That looks like involving racism and how it impacts our kids, our parents, our families, when we're working with individuals through therapy and through sessions. So I'm going to stop there. But again, I think this is a conversation that needs to continue. And I hope those of you that are watching are certainly getting something out of it. So we'll move on to our last question, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So our next question is, what are some tips? And we've seen that 91% of the people that's in this Zoom right now said that they experienced stress and anxiety in the last year. So as a social worker, what are some tips that you can provide to those of us that are here on dealing with stress, loss, and anxiety in COVID? I'll repeat it one more time. What are some tips on dealing with stress, loss, and anxiety in the context of COVID? Starting with Abigail, going to Tricia, then to Ingrid.
Thanks for that. I just have to say I'm so inspired by Tricia and Ingrid and Shanequa, what you just said, speaking about your communities and the impact of COVID. I think this is such a good testament as to why we need social workers at the table when we're rebuilding this city. Social workers, we get the problems from all of the perspectives, all of the contributing factors that lead to these problems. And, you know, right when we started dealing with COVID, I started thinking about the ACEs study, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with that, but that measures the adverse childhood experiences and its impact on health later in adulthood. And for the last year, I've thought about how COVID is going to impact, and will our children, my children, I'm a mom I have 6-year-old twins and a 3-year-old. He's probably too young, but my 6-year-old twins have really been impacted by COVID. I mean, every other day they're asking if they can have a party when COVID's over, when the coronavirus is over. And my children are very lucky, and there are many children throughout the city who have lost a parent or a grandparent, a loved one. They're struggling with school, the trauma and the ACEs. It will be interesting to see what happens as we move forward, and we need social workers at the table to make sure that their mental health is cared for. And at the other end of the spectrum with our seniors, I've talked to so many older adults on the phone who have I've talked to adults who were crying because they were so lonely. The isolation that Tricia mentioned is not to be left out of this conversation. Isolation is a #1 killer for older adults, and people don't realize that. It is more lethal than smoking cigarettes. And when you have the technology divide that we haven't talked about, it is really hard for older adults who are scared to leave their apartment to feel connected. So I feel positive for the future of New York City, and with us at the table, I think we can address these issues. Now, when it comes to dealing with stress, admittedly, I'm not the best at dealing with my own stress. But the things that I've worked with when I've worked with clients, I've worked with traumatized children and adults in the past, and things that we found most effective were breathing exercises and meditation. We're lucky that if you're lucky enough to be technologically literate and you can go on Instagram or you can go on the internet, there's so many different exercises out there that are free that you can just pick up by searching hashtags and find things to do. But I think we really do have to prioritize ourselves, prioritize our self-care, take time for ourselves, move our bodies, and breathe.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I'm gonna a couple things for the question of how we do self-care. And yes, social workers are too often notorious for not practicing what we preach when it comes to self-care. I'm going to talk about one that's kind of new-ish. My hope is that we can learn a couple good lessons from this last year in terms of how we rethink about our workforce. The ability for flex work hours, the ability to work from home, not only is better for our environment, but it's more kind for parents to participate in the workforce completely. So I would like to think that hopefully we see industries that can kind of adopt and evolve and have more work from home opportunities, because I think ultimately it's going to expand the workforce for women and women of color, specifically. However, one downside, I believe, of this kind of new model of working from home is that we do not take sick days anymore. And the ability to kind of book yourself from 9 o'clock in the morning until 5 o'clock at night, or longer, back to back to back is far too easy, I think, in general. And so anecdotally, but I think that this is probably true, and excuse the baby crying in the background, he's really okay. He just doesn't like pajamas being put on him, so that's what you're hearing if you're hearing the screaming. Anecdotally, what I think happens is that just you get people who are extremely tired out faster. I don't think I've taken a sick day in the last year, because nobody's traveling anywhere. You're already home. It's too easy to work from home. So I think that one thing that we have to keep in mind, and particularly as we advocate for our workers, particularly as we advocate for our working families, is to keep those sick days, encourage people to take the time. Don't book yourself for 10 hours straight on Zooms. Try to give yourself some commuting time in between. Try to take those days. They're your days. You should take them. You should be pacing yourself as much as possible. And I think that it's really just I've been really kind of mulling over how we think about our workforce and what the new workforce kind of looks like, both in terms of physical space. I would love to see other uses for some of our empty storefronts, but also in terms of just how we take care of our working families. Speaking of workforce, the other thing I just want to mention is that we need to raise wages for the field of social work and our social services. It is ridiculous that we do see such pay disparities, particularly again for our home healthcare workers, but also in the field of social work. It is far time that we increase those wages. I also just think that it's about how we value mental health, and it's about how we as a city and as a society kind of put value on wellness and on comprehensively caring for communities and on healthcare in general. And now more than ever, I think is a really good opportunity to really rethink the value that we put on our healthcare workers, and social workers are included in that. So I would like to propose that we look at our city contracts. This is getting a little nerdy, but I do believe that the way that we as a city council and the way as we as elected officials can really move the needle on this is looking at the rate at which we're paying our social services under city contracts. And I am going to propose that we kick that up some. We all have a role to play in fighting for pay parity. We all have a role to play in deciding how much we're going to value our social services. And it is not just advocating for more social services, it's advocating for the contracts that we have and bumping that up. And so I think that that's really where my focus has been. Also, as much as I will be fighting for our workers, I also want to fight for our social workers, and it's through procurement and contracts. So that's where I'll leave that. But just keep in mind that every elected official, city, state, and federal level has a role to play in how we value our healthcare system.
Yeah, so I couldn't agree more about that with Tricia. Your point is really well taken. I think that speaking about what's happened over the last 12 months, we've had parents who've had to, as Abigail, I believe, said, and Shanequa, who've had to be teachers and nurses and, tutors within like, the drop of a hat, right? They were told, okay, now your kids are going to be learning from home. And what happens if you and your kids don't have access to internet services, right? You don't have access to Wi-Fi. A lot of our families in this community don't have Wi-Fi at home. A lot of our families don't know how to deal with like iPads and computers. And the reason I know that is because many of them during this pandemic, during the 12 months that have just passed, asked me, how do I log on to this Google Classroom? Like, what do I do? I mean, there's such a huge digital divide that we have not addressed adequately. And I believe we need to, for me, and the clients that I've talked to, they had so much stress, just having to deal with logging their kids onto their remote learning and then rushing off to do their own work, if they were lucky enough to work, right? From home. Many people were not lucky enough to work from home. And that's the community I represent of essential workers who were the bus drivers, the deliveristas. We had people who were childcare providers and manicurists, hair salon workers, all these people, right? They weren't really necessarily able to stay home and work. So what do? How do we support families like the families in our district? We have to find, really creative ways of supporting, undocumented families. Recently we had a very big success with the New York State budget that is now there's a $2.1 billion allotment for the Excluded Workers Fund. And that's really important for a community like mine because many are excluded workers that did not receive any support, any help from the government. They did not get stimulus checks. They did not qualify for unemployment. So imagine the level of stress and anxiety that these families went through, not having money to pay for rent, not having money to pay for food. That's traumatic. Can we just take that in? That is trauma right there. That induces trauma. That's violent, and having that sense of insecurity, like living paycheck to paycheck. How, that's also anxiety provoking, right? Like, how am I going to pay for food and rent? I don't have, I can't pay for medicine. I can't pay a doctor's bill. This is all very real to the families that I represent here, that I hope to represent here in this community. And so, but we're talking also about all New Yorkers, right? Like many New Yorkers are just a paycheck away from being homeless sometimes, and then I'm not, saying that facetiously. I'm saying it seriously, because if you fall sick and you don't work and you lose your job, then how are you going to pay your rent, and we really need to see how a lot of working families, they're struggling. They are struggling. They the city is becoming much more expensive. The rent is going higher and higher. So we have to think about ways to support families, right? Families like the ones that I hope to represent here, families who are working class, who are, again, just getting by paycheck to paycheck. So, and all of that affects our mental health. All of it does. So we have to, support families, but at the same time also help those individuals who have gone through so much trauma this last year, who've lost loved ones, who've gotten sick themselves and are still feeling some side effects from that. The collective trauma, can we talk about that? The collective trauma that we just went through, we have to slow it down and process it, right? It's a lot. It's a lot, and I think many social workers are often like, we're go, 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 go. We're always about helping others, and this might sound a little selfish, but we as social workers need to take better care of ourselves too, and I think that, it's hard, like for moms like Shanequa and Abigail and Tricia, to have to do it all. You're managing a household, you're working from home. It is hard. It is hard to do all that, to wear all those hats, and not, feel burnt out. You are all incredible women, and the women that I know that have been holding it down for their families, they're also stressed. They need a break, and so again, I can go on and on about all these issues, but I will stop there and turn it over to Shanequa.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ingrid, Tricia, and Abigail. Ingrid, excuse me, Tricia has to step out a little early, so feel free whenever you need to. As Ingrid just mentioned, we're always multitasking and just wearing so many roles and hats. So she does have to step out for another event, so she leaves early. I just wanted to announce that. So I'll sort of answer this on two levels. First, I want to talk about how do we deal with our own personal mental health? How do we balance ourselves? And so the first thing I want to introduce is mindfulness. And I saw it in a chat box. Someone talked about meditation. This is a very powerful tool and technique, which basically just means you're meditating, you're really becoming connected to yourself. You're breathing, you're relaxing your body, and it really helps to reduce stress. One of the things that I did last year for my employees during COVID was bring in a wellness coach that worked on that had a lot of mindfulness sessions with my workers. And I found this to be very helpful for them. They came back telling me and the executive team that this was very helpful whenever they took a mindfulness session in the middle of their workday. They felt much better. I also tell my workers, and I love Tricia, you were talking about this. I also tell my workers to take care of themselves. So I think the entire workplace, especially at my work culture with my organization, it's changed a lot. And I think it's an example of what other employers need to do. Just being flexible, especially for mothers that are working, right? It's hard to work from home. It's not easier, it's harder because sometimes you don't know when to close the laptop or when to shut off your phone, when to take breaks from the computer, right? And so as a workforce and employers, I believe that we need to be more flexible for those that are employees, to make sure we're creating a culture that values mental health. And I think that's really important. Some other things that you can do to really like reduce your stress is to be in tune with yourself. For those of you that deal with anxiety sometimes, or anxiety attacks, you might be fine one moment, and then maybe you've seen something and it triggered something. It was maybe an imagery or a scent or something that triggered that fight or flight in your brain, right? And then immediately you felt like you were in danger. That's probably anxiety. And a lot of times we're not in tune with ourselves. And so being in tune with your triggers and knowing what they are so you can prevent them is really important. And so you can be proactive. So maybe talking through, like understanding if you're having an anxiety attack, to ask yourself, what's happening? What is this an anxiety attack? What was I just looking at? What was happening? What was my day like that caused this? And really to really connect with yourself. A lot of us are out of tune with ourselves, with our emotions, with our own mental health. And so it's hard to take care of our own selves. So be in tune with yourself. Eating and dieting, which I am not the best person to give this advice, but eating and dieting is really essential to your mental health. So eating balanced meals, remembering to eat, remembering to drink water. I remember there were times when I didn't drink water, my blood pressure went low. I'm like, oh my goodness, I feel dizzy. Then I have to think about it. Shanequa, did you drink water? No, you didn't. Get some water, stay hydrated. That sounds very simple, but a lot of times we forget to do that as parents and when we're running around doing so much. So get a nice jug of water, one of those bottled waters. Take it with you to work if you're, or to your computer if you're working from home. Get you some healthy snacks, boiled eggs, whatever, and eat balanced meals. Spend time with your loved ones. I know that's hard if you're not able to travel. You can use your video. Use video more than on the phone, because honestly, when you're able to chat or to talk via video, there's another connection that happens. Abigail was right, hit it right on the mark when she talked about isolation is the number one killer. That is correct. Isolation, loneliness, that is the number one cause of death in seniors. So try to spend time with loved ones, even if it's not in person. Use it, use your phone and video chat. Set limits and boundaries with your phone and your computer. Don't work yourself till you drop. And I need to take that same advice, but know when to close the computer, know when to step away. If you're starting to get headaches or starting to feel not so good, step away. It's okay. And I tell my daughter the same thing because she's in remote learning. Tell your kids that too, right? Have those conversations with their teacher. Find a therapeutic hobby, something that you enjoy doing, whether it's crocheting, dancing, singing, writing, reading, whatever it is. Find a therapeutic hobby. And one of the other things that I did in my organization was mental health days. So I allow my employees to take off for mental health days. Don't ask why. If they needed a mental health day, go ahead and take it. And I think that's something that we need to implement into our workforce. For parents, set boundaries, set a schedule for your kids, join a parent support group if you can, sign up for therapy for you and your kids if you need to, practice parental self-care, and be open and honest with your kids. You're not Superwoman, you're not Superman. So, those are some tips that I have. On a more legislative side, and I mentioned this already, in our workforce, we need to prioritize mental health and the workforce. We need to make sure that we allow employees to take off for mental health days, for wellness days. We need to incorporate mental health services and the workforce, especially for essential workers that obviously were on the ground, the ones sort of dealing with all of the deaths and trauma firsthand. I would love to really pass legislation that provides crucial mental health services for not only essential workers, but also for all workers. So that is my spiel, and I'm going to stop there. We are coming to the close of our time together. But before we do that, we definitely wanted to open it up for questions or question and answers. So if there's any questions or comments, and I've seen some coming into chat box, but if there are any questions, comments, David, thank you so much for that. He said, amazing group of powerful council candidates and powerful social workers. Glad to hear all of you. Thank you so much, David. Very, very, very nice. Thanks, Tricia. Tricia put in her link. And the other candidates, feel free to put in your web address of how people can get in contact with you, or your email address. Yep. Are there any questions, any comments, or anything that any of you wanted to? Oriana, looks like you're raising your hand.
I have a question. Yes, thank you so much for this event. I wanted to know what you all think that at the city level can be done to increase mental health care access. I'm thinking particularly of kids, that's who I work with, but whether it's increasing school-based mental health, which is my space, or even just, I have so many, it's just hard if you have a child that you need to find a therapist for. It can be hard because the clinics may have waiting lists, and the private therapists don't take a lot of insurance. I mean, I know like people that have GHI, which is like a lot of the teachers have GHI, a lot of therapists just don't take it. They can't find help. They can't find mental health care. So I'm wondering what can be done at a city level about expanding that access.
I'll just jump in and say the New York Health Act, that's at the state level. But if we were to pass that, then that would be make a big difference for families with GHI and other families who are struggling to get mental health services because of their insurance. If New York State can move forward and have the New York Health Act, that would really be a step in the right direction. I also think we absolutely need to fully fund school-based mental health programs. I mean, this is where schools are. Teachers and guidance counselors and social workers pick up on students that need those extra services. They should be provided in school, and we need more funding to go into school-based mental health services.
And I just want to add, I know that New York City has New York City Care, which is a program that Mayor de Blasio set up, and it's for those who don't have insurance. And so it's been kind of rolled out by borough, and I believe Queens is the latest borough to have access to New York City Care. However, it's very limited. So with New York City Care, we have only access to the public health, the public hospitals. So in our case, it would be Elmhurst Hospital and others that like Metropolitan, et cetera. So we need to be able to expand that, and not just to public hospitals, but to community health centers, right? To private practitioners. We need to be able to do that in order for people to have access to mental health services. And again, it shouldn't take weeks to get an appointment to see a mental health therapist. And this is what's happening. Sometimes, it takes longer than that. I know the waiting, what do you call it? I forgot the name of it. The waiting line? Not the waiting line.
Waiting list?
List. Thank you. The waiting list in some of the agencies here in Queens are months long. Like it takes a month or two to get an appointment with a therapist. And that means that the need is so great. That's why we need more access to mental health services and to therapists that are culturally, have a cultural frame of understanding how to work with communities of color. But we definitely need to push for the New York State Health Act, because that way we can have insurance, right, to pay for all these mental health services, medical health services. And absent of that, New York City Care can be expanded to include community health centers and private doctors and mental health therapists.
Thanks, Oriana.
David has
David, is he there? Go ahead, David.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all. I just have a question related to, you can look at the question and answer it not just with older adults, but my interest is older adults. So the city doesn't spend a huge amount of money on older adults. It's the fastest growing population in the city. And I'm very concerned about the underserved part of that population. Like as an example, I know the city spent a huge amount of money on the Get Food NYC, but it's very much tech-based, meaning that, you have to have a computer for a lot of these services, and we don't have the capacity in the city to meet these underserved people. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about any ideas that you might have about how do we reach and serve underserved parts of the population in terms of older adults, or even in terms of kids and adults.
I'm happy to start, and then anyone else can jump in. I mean, we know that we have the infrastructure to reach people who are homebound because of the census. We had people in buildings knocking on doors with tablets. And I think we need to tap into that infrastructure in order to reach inbound adults, older seniors, older adults who can't leave. And I don't understand why we weren't doing that for the COVID vaccine. And I think we should be able to do that for technological literacy. And right now we're in a pandemic, so it's a little bit more complicated, but as more and more people are getting vaccinated, I think that that's the way we need to go. We need to put boots on the ground. We need city workers out there. We need outreach on the ground to reach people.
I would say that many times, I think even doctors really miss the opportunity when they are seeing patients, and they may be depressed and they may be anxious or have PTSD, and doctors sometimes don't even see that. And so that's a huge missed opportunity, especially for communities like mine, which are really underserved. And so I think that in order for us to improve services for these underserved communities, we have to also talk to doctors. What to look out for, right? What signs do we see of a person who's depressed, of a person who's experiencing anxiety, psychosis, whatever, you know, they're presenting with. So we have to also focus on that kind of education for primary care physicians. You know, and as Abigail said, I think, you know, we have to make sure that people are informed. And I don't know if it means, you know, doing more of that education in the community by perhaps having kiosks, perhaps having, you know, like they have with healthcare, right? That they're offering insurance. Why don't we also have some kind of, you know, community service that we talk about mental health services, what they are, how you can get help. So, you know, going to health fairs, those kind of things. We have to continue to come to the community, go to the schools, the preschools, and talk about, you know, how to reduce stress. I mean, you can talk about mental health in ways that aren't scary for people, you know, and so we have to meet people where they are. We can't expect them to come to us. They, you know, it's not going to work. So going to these community community health centers, going to pre-Ks, you know, going to health fairs, all of those are opportunities for us to meet people where they are and to educate them about the services that are available to them in the community.
Awesome. And I'll just add in on piggybacking on you and Abigail, I definitely think there needs to be some education on destigmatization. I think that mental health a lot of times is stigmatized in Black and Brown communities. And as a result, it's a deterrent from people even accessing care. So I think that a lot of education, awareness, informing the community, destigmatizing it within Black and Brown communities, so that people are actually utilizing the services. And then also we need to really invest in community-based organizations and partners who have the capacity and bandwidth to provide these services through RFPs, so that we're funding these nonprofits to be able to provide these crucial services. Most of the times, 99% of the times, nonprofits and community-based organizations, they already have the access to families. They're already doing the work. They're probably already in the homes, or already, again, have relationships with those people that are underserved. So we really need to make sure we're involving them when it comes to mental health and really prioritizing. Again, it has to be prioritized in terms of access. So that's my spiel. And I hope that was, I hope we answered your question, David. Great, wonderful. We have room for one more question. So anyone else, burning question that you want to
I think Justina raised her hand.
Oh, who?
Justina from Vocal New York.
Oh, Justina, did you want to?
Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Jacinta. Thank you for this amazing platform. My question is in regards to mental health care and, let's say, child welfare and family court and domestic violence. As you may or may not know, domestic violence, intimate partner violence is on a surge in New York City, and we have limited services to help families. And unfortunately, while many people may receive mental health in a positive way, it's actually criminalized, stigmatized, and institutionalized for disfragmented communities. I would like to know what policies or legislations do you have in mind to protect children, families, and older adults' HIPAA rights, as I'm starting to learn that often people are misfortunately either overdiagnosed or misdiagnosed to appeal to a certain criminalized services, such as like bipolar, right? It's a one-size-fit-all medical coding, and it's not really the right treatment plan for an individual, but it's great for criminalization. So I'm just curious, how would the candidates approach the prevention and protection from a policy and legislation perspective to encourage others to receive services without feeling criminalized?
I guess I can try to answer that. So that was very layered, and I'm going to try to focus on one aspect of it because you talked about child welfare and in the context of mental health services and making sure parents, particularly moms, have access, but they're not criminalized. Um, it's interesting because I actually started drafting up some policy on the decriminalization of mental health and moms and child welfare. And I think that really to enter that we have to deal with the issue of systemic racism, which is a real thing. And unfortunately, it does show up, and our it shows up in mental health, whether we want to admit it or not. It does. And sometimes as social workers, and we've had this conversation, I sit on the board for National Association of Social Workers, New York City chapter, and we've talked about sometimes how social workers are implicit and oppression and racism. And so I think we have to be aware of that. We have to make sure we're addressing systemic racism and mental health services. So that means that we have to not criminalize people when they're coming for help, even if they have some involvement and child welfare. Our mental health services should not be so medicalized, which essentially it is. We have to move more towards healing and circles of healing and more ethnic centered practices, which is another thing that I've been really working on, is the intersection between mental health and racism, understanding how those two factors interact and finding ways to make sure as mental health workers, as social workers, as therapists, that we are approaching this from a lens that's anti-racist. And a lot of times we don't think about that, right? We think about racism when it comes to police reform, when it comes to affordable housing and every other system, but sometimes we don't think about it in the context of mental health. So I think that, from a child welfare standpoint, we have to address systemic racism and child welfare. We have to make sure that when mothers are in domestic violence situations, which I have firsthand seen as a social worker that's worked with a lot of domestic violence victims, I've seen kids snatched away because the mother refused to leave a relationship. And so they became to an extent, the victims became the criminals. And it's a very twisted sort of theory, but what needs to happen is a reforming of our child welfare system, really, to approach that. And then there has to be overlap and intersection with how do we not just reform our child welfare system, but how do we support parents and decriminalize mental health, people that are seeking mental health, whether they're domestic violence victims, whether they're moms that have open or indicated cases. How do we decriminalize mental health? And how do we look at mental health in a way that we're centering, that we're anti-racist and we're ethnic centered in our approaches? So I hope that answered it, but those are some legislation that I would love to work on.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback on what you said, Shanequa. I do believe that our child welfare system needs a rehaul, a reimagining, right? Because there are a lot of parents who are afraid, to even seek mental health services because they tell their children, don't tell the therapist that, I spanked you. Don't tell the therapist, that I took this away from you because you were not listening. So there's a lot of fear, right? And that's antithetical, right, to the work that we're trying to do, which is to build trust, to build a bond with these families, right? And if they already are coming to us with fear, like we are the ones that are going to be evaluating them and making sure that they do what they have to, because if not, they're going to get in trouble with, their agency, the agency that's dealing with their case. So there's a lot to be done there. And I think, families who are poor, low income, who are undocumented, whose first language isn't English, when they clash with the child welfare system, it can be so destabilizing, for them, for their families. There have been many families here in this community who have been separated, right, because of, a complaint about abuse. And I'm not taking abuse lightly, please don't think that. But, you know, it could be that in their home countries, they have certain disciplining rituals that we don't accept here. And so how do we manage all these different, you know, the different issues, cultural issues, you know, issues on racism, and like there's it's so layered, it's so complicated, but we have to really work on this child welfare system so that mental health services are not, you know, feared, that they're actually, you know, welcome. Like, oh, this person wants to help me. They don't want to hurt. They don't want to hurt my child. You know, they don't want to separate my family, because that's the immediate thought. Oh, if I speak the truth, if I'm honest, you know, I'm going to get in trouble. And that again doesn't work in a therapeutic relationship. So we have to reimagine this system.
I totally agree with that, and the both of what you said. And the only thing that I would add is that I also think we need to put a thoughtful curriculum together into the prevention and the recognition of domestic violence. We need to start talking about this very early on with our girls, because prevention is less expensive and less costly in a human capital than dealing with a problem once it's a problem. I have worked in child welfare. I absolutely believe we need to overhaul child welfare. I've also worked in domestic violence. I've also been part of a child abuse investigative team. And so I've been on the side of working with ACS and workers who were investigating domestic violence. And I had one worker say to me, I haven't slept in a week because I'm afraid this mom is going to be killed. And it's a very serious. And I think we also need to include in this conversation prevention and education.
Thank you very much for this feedback. I truly appreciate it. And if I can just leave one note for the candidates that are moving forward, one of the opportunities for the New York City public schools, especially during parent-teacher conferences, is not only to consider offering social emotional learning support for children, but this needs to be a collective community event where education is not just top down and only in the Department of Education, but also at the community level. And parenting classes or parenting for special needs should not be used in a form of punishment, fear, or threats, but there should be common practices at the school so that parents can unite for peer support and milestone development. And that could potentially decrease the amount of cases that are being unfortunately reported for good or non-good reasons to SCR.
Wow, that was really excellent. Thank you so much for that, Jacinta, and for your wisdom. We'll definitely all be considering and taking that in, and 100% agree it's essential. One of the things that I do through my nonprofit is provide parental support and classes for parents so that it's a safe space to be able to have those kind of conversations. And I think that's something that we need to definitely prioritize and expand within the Department of Education, that when we're thinking about mental health of our kids, we also have to think about the mental health of our parents. So thank you. Great. So we are at the end of our time together. We'd love to sit with you more and talk, but we all have families and we have to also practice what we preach, and that's self-care. So we all have little ones that we need to also get into bed. But we really enjoyed our time together, and truly thank you for sharing this space with us, for listening to us. We do hope that you were able to get something value and something worthwhile out of this conversation. I think most of us has put in our websites in the chat box. Feel free to grab our websites and follow up with us if you want to get involved in any of our campaigns. We'd love to have you. And again, thank you so much. Remember to take care of yourself. Remember to put yourself first. Remember to practice self-care. We'll be sending out the recording so that you all can watch this at your own time and hopefully listen to some nuggets that you may have missed the first time around. So thank you again so much. Thank you all that's watching through Facebook Live. For those that will be watching later, thank you for joining us through Zoom. Have a great night, everyone. We hope to see you soon.
Good night, everyone. Thank you all.